After the last episode, I know some of you are thinking that has to be the worst of it. That has to be rock bottom because surely the second half of the season is going to improve, as it can't possibly get worse. But it does. As it turns out, there's a really good reason why the show continues to get worse, and it stems from the original direction that the writers had for the series. Recently, one of the writers gave an interview where he explained the main aspect of the series was to have Obi-Wan figure out that Anakin was actually Darth Vader, and he and the other writers on the show discussed at length all the ramifications that could have possibly happened from Obi-Wan discovering this secret. Not until after the writers made their plans did they discover that, oops, Obi-Wan actually found out about this in Revenge of the Sith, and he had already known for about 10 years. At first, he and the other writers didn't even believe it and needed to double and triple check with other people working at LucasArts, but even after confirming it, apparently they decided to plow on ahead anyways. And it's very important to note that Obi-Wan knowing about Anakin becoming Darth Vader is not some hidden tidbit of lore that you'd have to search through 15 wikis in order to find, but rather it was the primary catalyst of the final confrontation for the Revenge of the Sith movie. Even the most casual of viewers would have known this. I would expect a writer who was hired for a show like this to be extremely knowledgeable about Star Wars lore, but it would appear that the writers for this series never even bothered to watch the movies. The irony here is that in that same interview, the writer explained how it was important for him to adhere to canon and that he believed that he and the other show creators had thus far perfectly aligned with all of the existing canon. Obviously, this is not true in the slightest, but it actually gets worse because days later, after being confronted with all of this, the same writer acknowledged the differences in canon and the changes that he had made, while making the excuse that his version was an improvement and that he essentially knows better than George Lucas. As ridiculous as that is, he's not alone in that sort of thinking. The fact of the matter is that all of the Disney writers, whether it's for Star Wars or the MCU, have shown that they simply do not care in the slightest about existing canon, with some of them even going so far as to be openly hostile to the idea of any kind of research and then openly bragging that they deliberately changed things in order to break existing lore merely to anger some of the longtime fans. When Disney is hiring writers and directors who don't have sufficient talent and who don't care about the story itself, there shouldn't be any surprise at all with the result. Obi-Wan is bad, Episode 4. We begin with a quick montage of both Vader and Obi-Wan being submerged in bacta-tanks to help treat their burns. However, this comparison is absurd because while Vader was very seriously wounded, Obi-Wan has only minor burns on one of his arms, which I have to point out seems a bit strange, considering that Obi-Wan was dragged through the fire. He suffered very little injury. Even his hair and his beard were untouched by the flame. But then again, if the writers can't be bothered to care about the big stuff, they certainly won't pay attention to the little stuff. Kinda like the fact that Obi-Wan and the Sand Snake are now on a different planet. And I have to ask, how was this even possible? With Vader in the area, there was at least one Imperial battlecruiser in orbit, possibly more. For what possible reason would Vader have allowed any of the ships to leave the planet?
That is an entirely implausible plot development.
Since Obi-Wan is the #1 concern for Darth Vader, and Vader knew that Obi-Wan was still on planet Nevada, why didn't Vader do everything in his power to keep him contained there? His next step should have been to call in as many battlecruisers as possible to entirely blockade the planet.
Is that legal?
These are simple yet important questions that the writers should be asking, but instead they allow the end of one episode to create a completely blank slate opening into whatever they want for the next one. It's the equivalent of saying, once upon a time, a man walked into a forest, one thing led to another, and now he's the king.
That's just lazy writing.
This issue is part of a much larger problem when it comes to modern storytelling in TV shows and movies. The writers want certain high point moments of interest to occur, and they give very little consideration to what happens between those high points. So rather than telling a coherent story that follows a logical cause and effect, It's just a string of high-tension events that are very loosely connected. Regardless, the Sand Snakes group has information on where the Inquisitor base is located, and it's a moon in the Mustafar system, which happens to be where Vader is located. The plan is to use the Sand Snake's fake officer identity to gain access. On the way, Obi-Wan is practicing using the Force, and this is something that I haven't talked about too much in previous videos, but it's important to point out how absurd it is for Obi-Wan to be as weak and powerless as he currently is.
I have seen stalks of corn with better physiques.
While it's true that Obi-Wan did need to hide from the Empire, he couldn't use his Force powers or his lightsaber in public. That would have given away his identity and location. It still would have been extremely important for him to continue training. After Revenge of the Sith, Obi-Wan had only two priorities. The first was to protect Luke Skywalker, and the second was to do the training given to him by Yoda so that he could learn to commune with Qui-Gon Jinn. If Obi-Wan had seemingly lost all connection to the Force and had not been training for the last 10 years, then I have to ask, exactly how did he expect to be able to protect Luke Skywalker when a genuine threat appeared? How was he supposed to fight off any potential threats if he had buried his lightsaber in the middle of the desert and essentially forgotten how to use the Force?
I have questions.
Even if he had needed to do it in secret, there are numerous reasons why Obi-Wan would still have been an active and powerful Force user. From what we saw in the first episode, it's clear that Obi-Wan genuinely cares about Luke, so then why would he abandon all of the skills required in order to keep him safe?
This doesn't make any sense.
Meanwhile, Ririva has been trying to get information out of Leia. Remember that Ririva has the ability to effortlessly read the mind of others, and yet for some reason, at first, she doesn't try to use this ability on Leia, which you would expect to be very easy to do. Instead, she tries to trick Leia into believing that Obi-Wan is dead and that the Sand Snake was actually one of the bad guys. It really doesn't make any sense at all, and Leia refuses to give up any information. But don't worry, it gets worse. The Sand Snake arrives on the moon, and as she's going through security, she's stopped by one of the guards. He runs a quick scan of the Sand Snake's credentials and finds that she doesn't actually work at that facility and therefore would not have proper clearance to enter. This leads to a very predictable and very woke interaction, where the Sand Snake then proceeds to berate the security guard, who just so happens to be a white guy, because of course. The rest of the scene plays out like your typical woke weirdo power fantasy, as she demands that he call her sir, and that she is his commanding officer.
I am the strongest woman this state has ever seen!
Side note, a couple of quick things about this. First, the use of sir is not exclusively for male officers. It can actually be used as a general term of respect for any officer, women included. However, the commanding officer thing is wrong. She's not in his chain of command, so that would not be his commanding officer. The term that the writers should have used is superior officer, but as I said before, if they can't be bothered to care about the big things, they certainly won't notice the little things. And yeah, I know this might be a little bit on the nitpicky side, but I was in the army for 8 years, and messing up this stuff is extra aggravating to me. It's kind of like when they say clip instead of magazine.
Stop it!
Regardless, she's then given access to the building. She sits down at a workstation, begins giving instructions to Obi-Wan, who has been swimming deep underwater towards the building. He gets inside because there's an open pool at the bottom of the building for some reason. A stormtrooper hears him and goes to check it out, but Obi-Wan is able to quickly dispatch him. And I couldn't help but notice that despite swimming through literally an ocean, Obi-Wan's hair and clothes were almost completely dry. It's pretty obvious that just prior to filming this scene, they simply used a spray bottle to give him a slightly damp appearance, when in truth, Obi-Wan should have been soaking wet and dripping water all over the place. Again, if they can't be bothered to care about the big stuff, they're not going to pay attention to the little stuff. Apparently, this entire ocean consists of magical, fast-drying water. Funnily enough, though, this actually happens again later in the episode. Meanwhile, Ririva is finally trying to use the Force to read Leia's mind, but it doesn't work. There isn't any kind of a struggle like what we've seen with other characters in previous situations. Leia doesn't appear to be in any kind of discomfort at all. It just simply doesn't work. And while it's true that Leia being Force-sensitive would give her some small resistance, she is also a completely untrained child. The idea that it just wouldn't work on her is utter nonsense. But the problem is that the writers have written themselves into a corner. They've given this unbelievably powerful ability to Ririva to put her on a pedestal because she checks off the correct diversity boxes, and now it creates an issue with the story, because they want to have another high point that's going to appear later in the episode, but in order to get there, they need to make it so that Ririva can't actually read the mind of Leia. And how do they resolve this? They don't really give any explanation, they just make it not work.
I expect nothing, and I'm still let down.
Speaking of nonsense, what kind of security do you think there would be in this extremely sensitive and important base? There should probably be cameras absolutely everywhere, but nope, not even one. Instead, it's empty hallway after empty hallway, with only a single droid slowly wandering through the halls. This allows Obi-Wan to go pretty much wherever he wants, while making minimal effort to avoid the droid.
That is one big pile of shit.
Eventually, a couple stormtroopers do show up, but Obi-Wan is able to easily evade them by hiding behind a piece of the wall structure. And then we get a very predictable, phony piece of tension where the Sand Snake tries to talk to Obi-Wan through the communicator, and of course the stormtroopers overhear it and begin searching for Obi-Wan, but he manages to use the Force to distract them in the opposite direction. Since Ririva can't use her mind-reading power for some reason, she decides to use the interrogation pain device in order to get Leia to talk. Unfortunately, Obi-Wan can't get there in time, so the Sand Snake needs to provide a distraction, and she does so by telling Ririva that she has important information about the Jedi smuggling organization. This includes details on how the group is run and where they're currently located. However, after hearing this, Ririva makes the absolutely absurd leap of logic that the Sand Snake is lying and making it all up. Now, we as the audience know that the Sand Snake could be making it all up, or possibly using older information that the group no longer needs, but regardless, the idea that Ririva suddenly makes the connection is nonsense.
I am insulted on your behalf.
This situation is exactly what I talked about in a previous video, where Ririva never needs to earn anything. The show writers simply give her all the correct choices because they want to promote how amazing she is. During this, Obi-Wan is rescuing Leia, but moments later they happen to be spotted by that one single droid that's been roaming around the area. The alarm goes up and Obi-Wan begins fighting stormtroopers while the Sand Snake is placed into custody. However, moments later we get one of the most hilariously pathetic escapes by the Sand Snake, supported, of course, by two extremely compliant stuntmen. Look at this garbage. She hits this one guy in the head with a slap that wouldn't have even hurt him even if he wasn't wearing a helmet, and yet he's reeling and almost doubling over from it. The show wants us to believe that this hit from a small, frail, physically weak actress is somehow on par as if it had been a punch by Mike Tyson. She then grabs the other guy's blaster and takes out both of them, but if you look at the stormtroopers, you can tell that neither of them were actually trying to fight back. Instead, they were deliberately putting themselves into a position where they could easily get hit by the blaster.
This was just hilariously bad and pathetic.
Obi-Wan and Leia are chased into a tunnel where a blaster cracks a window, threatening to allow the ocean to rush in. There are a bunch of stormtroopers now behind a locked door trying to get into the hallway. This leads to a pretty stupid sequence of events. Obi-Wan is using the Force to hold back the water so Leia can escape down the hallway. The stormtroopers are trying to get the door open, and some of them are even firing blasters through the small open gap. Eventually, the stormtroopers get the door open all the way, but rather than just trying to, shoot Obi-Wan while he's distracted, a dozen or so stormtroopers decide the best course of action is to run down the hallway toward the guy with a lightsaber.
But the people are retarded.
I cannot comprehend why they would do this. They're using blasters, which are more effective at range, and yet they want to try to get in close to Obi-Wan, who is using a lightsaber, which is only effective at close distance. But don't worry, it gets worse. Keep in mind that while these stormtroopers are running down the hallway, again, none of them are actually trying to shoot at Obi-Wan, they just run towards him. Obi-Wan then allows the wall to break, which floods the hallway. The stormtroopers get caught in the water, but Obi-Wan is just barely ahead of it. The Sand Snake closes the door on the other side, allowing Obi-Wan to escape. And remember that water thing I mentioned earlier? Well, this is the second part of that. Not only is Obi-Wan completely dry, but not even a single drop of water somehow managed to get through the door before it was closed.
What? No.
But if you go back the last few seconds, you can very clearly see that this is not the case. Obi-Wan was close enough to get wet from the water, and the door was closed as the water was hitting it. So some of it should have been going through, but the problem is that all the water is just CGI. None of it is done with practical effects, so the show creators never think about these sorts of things. Their overly heavily reliance on CGI makes all of this just look far less realistic. Something else pretty dumb that I noticed was that Obi-Wan was standing directly in front of the cracked window, and he did not move until after the water started coming in, but when we see the water coming in, Obi-Wan is nowhere to be found. He's been teleported halfway down the hallway, and then he sees the water coming in through the cracked window, which he was standing directly in front of, and yet he doesn't get hit by it. He just sees it from a distance and then turns around and runs. So again, this is just another great example of the show creators not really caring, and they just don't pay any attention to detail.
I wouldn't want somebody tracing my steps, pointing out all the mistakes I was making.
The Sand Snake then comes up with the super genius, brilliant idea on how to get Leia out of the building without anyone seeing her, and that is for Obi-Wan to just wear a really big coat and for Leia to hide underneath it.
How come God hogs up all the good followers and we get all the retards?
I can just imagine some idiot in the writer's room saying, well, how is Leia gonna sneak out? And then someone else goes, oh, you know how kids sneak into movie theaters when they have like a really big coat? Let's do that.
Truly, you have a dizzying intellect.
Look at how stupid this is. Someone wrote this scene. Someone filmed this scene. Someone edited this scene. And at no point did someone stop and say, you know, this looks really fucking dumb. The group makes their way outside, and despite the amazing disguise, they're confronted by Reva before they can get into the Sand Snake ship. The group is completely surrounded by dozens of stormtroopers, and then we get a whole bunch more garbage in the form of Deus Ex Machina. Some of the other pilots who work with the Sand Snakes just show up out of nowhere and begin strafing the stormtroopers.
It's very convenient.
Very convenient.
This is completely unearned because there was no communication between the Sand Snake and the pilots. They just magically showed up at the exact right moment. But don't worry, it gets worse. If you actually watch the ships flying in, you can see that they absolutely would have smashed right into the building. This is part of the strafing run, and you can see that both of these ships are maybe 20 feet away from the wall, and they are moving incredibly fast. Both of these ships would need to lose all forward momentum, and then make a perfect 90-degree turn in order to not hit the wall. Since neither of these ships are capable of doing that maneuver, how are the writers going to get around this? Well, it turns out that they just cut away and don't show it. 1 second the ship would be smashing into the wall, and the next second they're perfectly fine and they're flying out in the sky again. As I said, if they don't care about the big stuff, they're definitely not going to pay attention to the little stuff. One of the ships then makes a landing, and for some reason none of the stormtroopers try to attack it, which allows Obi-Wan and the others to quickly jump inside. The ship is then able to escape, but Reva is able to throw an explosive toward the other ship and destroy it. Now, the correct course of action here for the Inquisitors would be to immediately scramble every ship and TIE fighter they have available, but instead the Inquisitors just stare longingly at the small ship as it slowly flies away. This course of action does make sense for Reva, and we'll find out why in just a moment, but it doesn't make any sense for the other Inquisitors to just do nothing. Shortly after, Vader arrives and is about to kill Reva when she reveals that she was able to put a tracker inside of Leia's droid. This will allow them to find Obi-Wan again, and also the main base of the entire Jedi smuggling organization. And of course, Vader is very impressed because Reva is so incredibly smart and cunning, and she's just amazing, and she's the bestest ever. The final scene is the rebels flying away and the tracker inside the droid activating. This show is garbage. It's one thing for the writers on the show to not understand canon, it's another thing for them to dismiss it on purpose, and yet it's even worse when the writers genuinely believe that their changes are an improvement because they believe they know better than the original author. Whether or not something is an improvement to the original story is largely irrelevant. Once the original author has established something as canon, for good or for bad, that needs to be adhered to. If you don't like it, then make your own story. What we saw in this episode was an amazing lack of attention to detail, combined with pointless nostalgia, and of course, more pandering to woke weirdos. This series keeps on getting worse, but thankfully, that's the end of episode 4.